you have to be sure about it. You have to be just as sure about that decision to move on or to stay as you were when you were initially called into pastoral ministry.
Poimen Ministries Podcast Network. Strength for today's pastor. Here's your host, Bill Holdridge. Bill is the director of Poimen Ministries, which is a team of former longtime senior pastors who are available to strengthen pastors, to strengthen churches.
Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor. This is podcast number 36. Today we're going to be talking to pastors who are thinking about transitioning out of their church. You've come to that moment in your life where you feel that it's time to move on. Maybe the Lord has something new and fresh for you. Maybe you have new vision for your church. And so you're thinking about transitioning your church. And so you're reaching out with questions. This is something that we've been involved with Poimen Ministries, but not exclusively, of course. We do a lot of video chats, equipping conferences, podcasts, huddles, many phone calls. But we do have some experience in helping churches transition, so thanks for listening to this podcast. But it's also important for us to tell you that we're not at all trying to get the older guys to step out so that the younger guys can take over. That's not our business. That's not our focus. That's not even our heart. That's really up to Jesus, obviously. He's the head of the church. But our position is that as long as the senior pastor is healthy and has vision and is discipling people, fulfilling the Great Commission, he can go and should go as long as the Lord blesses and as long as the Lord calls him to do it. So there's really no need to leave. But obviously there are a number of churches that are in transition, that have been in transition, and that will continue to be the case in the future. Some of the reasons for a transition are sad reasons. Perhaps the pastors become incapacitated through illness, or perhaps because the pastor died and went home to be with the Lord. Those are sad reasons that are hard for anyone in the church to deal with. But there are also bad reasons, and these are reasons which include moral failure, or perhaps ethical failure, or perhaps wholesale leadership failure. And when a transition is necessary because of those reasons, it's always an unfortunate thing, of course. But there are also good reasons why a pastor might be thinking about transitioning his church. He maybe has new vision for his future. There's something that has just started to become real to him, to his heart. He just wants to do it. He has to do it. He feels like if he doesn't do it and take that step of faith, he will be being disobedient to the Lord. So he wants to follow through. He's got a vision for the future, or maybe he has a different vision for the church he's been pastoring for all those years. He's got a different vision for the way the church is going to be organized or how it's going to be led, and he really has a heart that should happen, and it's going to necessitate that he step aside for that to happen. In any case, whether the reason for a pastor transitioning is a sad reason, a bad reason, or a good reason, there are a lot of questions being asked about what to do, and they're going to continue to be asked. So we've learned a number of things in our helping churches, and we do have specific suggestions. And so what I want to talk today about are 5 specific suggestions for pastors thinking of transitioning out of their churches. 5 specific suggestions. And these all are going to be contained in show notes that are going to be made available. You can email us at strongerpastors@gmail.com, and we'll send those out to you. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. Or you can go to our website. We'll have those available as well on the Poimen Ministries website at the time that this podcast is released. So here are the 5 suggestions, and I'm going to go through these as quickly as I can, but I'm not going to go faster than I need to. The first suggestion is really decide. Number 1, really decide. Really decide. Are you called by God to stay in your church? Then figure out a way to make that as best a situation as you can and as fruitful as you possibly can. Or are you called to move out to some other form of ministry? Whatever decision you make, you have to be sure about it. You have to be just as sure about that decision to move on or to stay as you were when you were initially called into pastoral ministry. I had that experience myself back in February 2006, where I really felt like it was time for me to step aside from Calvary Monterey after 27 years. And I, looking back, don't regret that decision at all. I knew it was from the Lord. He had something else for me. That's the question that every pastor has to ask himself and ask the Lord and get confirmation on. Are you called by God to stay or move out to some other form of ministry? Really decide. So that's suggestion number one. Make that call and that election sure. Number two, at the very least, no matter what you decide to do about transitioning or not transitioning, at the very least, have an emergency transition plan in place. Whether you feel called to stay or whether you feel called to move on to something else, at least make sure you have an emergency transition plan in place. And the reason for that is obvious, I think. What's going to happen to the church if you die? Or what's going to happen to the church if you can't continue for some reason? You know, and I think about this a lot. Unless Jesus Christ returns before you're finished in your current ministry, someone else is going to be the pastor of your church. You're pastoring. Maybe you've pastored your church for 25 years. And maybe the Lord comes back in 15 years, but you're done in 5. Somebody else is going to be pastoring your church unless Jesus Christ comes back for his church before you're done. And so in that sense, we're all transitional pastors, and that's a great way to view the ministry, by the way, is that we are transitional pastors. We're always preparing for the next thing the Lord wants to do in our church. But that's an important thing. Need to have an emergency plan. Who is going to take over? How's that going to happen? Who's going to decide? What do your bylaws say about a transition plan? Do you have one in place? Is it been discussed among your board, your elders, and so on? These are things that need to be decided. So that's point number 2, suggestion number 2. At the very least, have an emergency transition plan in place, and of course, we'd be happy to help you with that if we can. Number 3, suggestion, don't feel like you have to do this transition thing alone, or don't feel like you have to figure out the process yourself. My good friend Mark Platt wrote an article, You Need a TSP. TSP stands for Transitional Senior Pastor. You need a transitional senior pastor. And in that great article, there were a number of reasons why the existing church leadership or whatever appointed committee, if there are committees in a specific church, whatever appointed committee is given the task of selecting a successor, they almost always get it wrong because they don't have experience and they don't really know a great starting point from which to start. Don't feel like you have to do it alone. Get some help, get some input, get some experience that can come alongside of you. And of course, you're familiar with Proverbs 1:5. A wise man will hear and increase learning. A man of understanding will attain to wise counsel. So hear what you can, read what you can, increase your learning on the subject of church transitions, and find wise counsel. And again, we'd be happy to be involved, but there are other places you can go as well for help. There are those that have been through the process within our tribe of Calvary Chapel churches. But don't try to do it alone, and don't leave your existing leadership team to handle it themselves if you decide to leave before your successor is appointed. Okay, so that's suggestion number 3. I can't stress that one enough. That one's huge. The failure of a pastoral transition is pretty predictable. At least there's going to be major hiccups and major issues if not handled well and not handled with sound counsel. Number 4 suggestion. If you're going to step aside, you have to ask this question. If you're going to step aside, is God calling you to be part of the process of choosing your successor? If you're going to step aside, is God calling you to be part of the process of choosing your successor? So what if the answer to that question is yes? God is calling me as the senior pastor that's leaving to be part of the process of choosing my successor. If the answer is yes, then the new pastor is going to have to come either from within your church or from outside of your church. And if there is no one from within that is a qualified, gifted, and called candidate, then you're going to have to bring in someone from without. If from within, what role will you have? If from without, what role will you have? Will you be the one that disciples this candidate into being ready to take over the lead role, the senior pastor position? Or another question related to that is, will you want someone that you can work with later if you're part of the process of selecting your successor? Maybe you want someone that you can work with later because you desire to remain in ministry within your church. Maybe in a pastor emeritus role or a missions pastor role or as a pastor at large role. Forget the title. You just want to still be involved. So you're going to want to find someone that respects you, that loves you, that you respect, that you love, that you can serve under, even though you're not going to be the senior pastor. And in that situation, you're going to want to get off the board of directors. And in that situation, you're going to want to recuse yourself from philosophical decisions that are made, major ministry decisions. But you make yourself available to be a source of counsel and input, but a safe source of counsel and input. If you want that kind of a relationship, then this guy that is brought in is going to have to be the right guy. And he's going to have to be somebody who has respect for you and love for you, and vice versa. You're going to have respect for him and love for him. So those are some of the questions to address if you are going to be part of the process, a material part of the process of choosing your successor. If you're not going to be part of the process just choosing your successor, that's really not your heart, then you're going to have to turn the process over to others to make the decision. And one of the first things you're going to need to do is check your bylaws. What do your bylaws say? There may be a specific process that has to be followed. And either you follow that process in the bylaws or you work with your leadership to change the bylaws before you move into a transition process so that it more reflects how you actually want to do things. And then you want to consider bringing in outside counsel and experience to help leaders because there are so many issues to deal with, as we'll see. Or you could consider bringing in a transitional senior pastor. Now, we of Poimen Ministries, we have been transitional senior pastor in a number of situations, and what that means is that we will actually move to the community in which you are pastoring, and we will assume the lead role in the church. We'll become the president of the board of directors, the senior pastor of the church. Will carry on all the normal senior pastoral duties. We'll steady the situation that is there if it needs steadying. We will disciple. We will prep. We will organize a group that can help us in identifying the next senior pastor, and we will move the church from whatever situation or condition they're in now. Are they grieving? Are they sad? Are they hopeful? Are they optimistic? Are they decimated? Are they splintered? Are they split? Whatever they are, we'll try to steady the church, and then we'll move in the direction of identifying the next pastor. What we are, if we do a senior pastor role, a transitional senior pastor role in a church, we are never candidates for that position, and we are simply there to assist them through the process of identifying their next pastor. And that's a possibility. I'm not recommending it in every situation. I'm just saying it's a possibility. It can be done from without. We could do it from a distance, which we've done in a number of times, helping provide counsel and experience. We don't even have to be the ones that help. There could be others that could do it. But you'll have to turn the process over to others to make the decision. And the key point here is don't have the people that are making the decision do it on their own. Make sure that there's someone else from the outside or even sound wisdom from within that does have experience that can help with the process because it's too big of a deal to do it without proper preparation. So those are the questions having to do with suggestion number 4. If you're going to step aside, is God calling you to be part of the process of choosing your successor? It's yes, then the pastor comes from within or without. If not, then you have to decide what role you will have. And if you don't want to be part of the process, you don't feel God is calling you to be part of the process, then that process is going to have to be turned over to others to make the decision. And then suggestion number 5. Suggestion number 5 is set up a specific, defined process and timetable. Set up a specific, defined process and timetable. So there's a lot I want to say on this particular point, and this will be our last point. If you're transitioning to someone within your church, so this is subpoint A. If you're transitioning to someone within your church, then you're going to need to establish a timetable. How long will the transition last? Will it be 1 year? Will it be 2 years? Will it be 3 years? You'll have to establish a specific timetable. Then you'll have to establish a preaching schedule. You will eventually preach less, teach less, and the man that has been identified to be your successor will preach more and teach more. There has to be a transition in the preaching schedule. There's going to have to be a transition of responsibilities, a transfer of responsibilities. The things that you're doing now are going to eventually have to all be passed to him. And so that too will be incremental, and you'll have to do that over a period of time. There'll have to be a timetable for the transfer of responsibilities, and this needs to be worked through, and it's quite a bit of work to work through a schedule like that, but it's doable, and we've seen it happen very successfully in several churches. And also you're going to want, and this is a key thing for the new pastor and for the guarantee of his success, there's going to have to be a transfer of authority, not just responsibilities, but a transfer of authority. Because if your transition plan is for 1 year, and on December 1st of the next year, 1 year from now, whatever the date, that's when that new pastor is going to be named, not just named, but presented and hands laid upon him, and that's going to be his first Sunday. Leading up to that time, all of the authority of the church is going to have to be passed to him that belongs to a senior pastor. He is going to have to be the president of the corporation. He's going to have to be the senior pastor. He's going to have to be the one that oversees the board of directors or the elder team or whatever form of government you have within your church. And so that transfer of authority has to happen as well as a transfer of responsibilities. But having said this, you have to establish a timetable with these kinds of things in it. It's really important to note that if your successor is going to be a younger man, realize that younger men will not wait, and they will not wait for you if the plan is nebulous. If it is not specific, they will either get bored, or they will not trust the process, or something else will come along that more fits what they're called to do, and they'll be gone. And you don't want to lose a good candidate because you haven't been specific enough with the process. And so this is something that I would highly recommend and suggest that you do, is create a timetable for the process of your transition. There also, along with that, is going to need to be a plan for what the church wants to do for you as the outgoing senior pastor and your retirement from your church. You're not necessarily retiring from ministry, but you are retiring from your church. So this is where you can use some outside help. It's really awkward for you to come up with a plan for yourself, obviously, and the board may not know where to start with such a subject, so bring in outside counsel and help them help your board and your elders come up with a plan for what they can do for you in your retirement from your church. What kind of compensation? How long will it last? What will be the compensation made up of? Okay, so that's all under letter A, the things that need to be established during your timetable. Now, if this is letter B. If you're transitioning to someone outside of the body, then you're going to need a way to find solid candidates. What we do is we help churches put together a pastoral prospectus. A prospectus is simply a description of the church, the area, the history of the church, some of the distinctives of the church, the community in which the church is located, and then a description of what that ideal candidate is like. Is he a younger man, preferably? Does he have prior senior pastoral experience? Is he going to be a Calvary Chapel pastor? Of course, that's what we support if we're helping a Calvary Chapel church find a transition. That's who we will help them look for. Someone who is committed to what we call the Calvary Chapel distinctives. This would be true of any church group that we may help transition with. We want, them to help identify someone that is consistent with their distinctives. But they have to put all that stuff in the pastoral prospectus. What is he like? What's his marriage like? What's his family life like? Is his wife supportive? All of these kinds of questions that are going to be asked. And then the candidates, after they complete the prospective requirements, and the prospective requirements will include something like a resume. It doesn't have to be a formal one. It will include things like having several links or CDs of past expositional Bible studies. It'll have at least one solid letter, a thorough letter recommendation from an existing senior pastor that is known and knows the candidate well, and these kinds of things. And these things get sent in, and then these candidates need to be vetted. And the best candidates need to be identified, and then there needs to be a process put in place to invite these candidates to come to the church and then possibly call them into the senior pastor position eventually. So all of that is a process, and it takes time and it takes effort. It can be very exciting, and it leads to the decision of who the Lord has called, and that's always a wonderful moment when the anointing oil comes down on the head of the next leader. Is always a wonderful thing for everyone. So that's letter B. If you're transitioning to someone outside of the body, then you need a way to find solid candidates. You need a way to vet those candidates. You need to identify the best candidates. You need a way to invite them and possibly call them to candidate at your church. You need a team to help you with the decision, to be a set of eyes and ears along with you. So these are the things that are necessary. And if it's not you that's involved materially in the process, then whoever it is that is going to be materially involved needs to be ready for all of that. And then letter C, under this last suggestion, set up a specific defined process and timetable. Letter C is the announcement to the body. This is really, really important and an important part of the process. It has to be done well. There has to be what I would call incremental communication. The worst possible thing that could be done would be to send this announcement out that you're leaving and someone else, Pastor X is going to be named as the new pastor, to do that by email, to do it by newsletter, or to do it by a Sunday morning announcement where everybody's caught cold and surprised, and the only ones that knew about it were the board of directors or the elder team. That would be the worst thing. So there has to be an incremental communication process so that people can be eased into this process and eased into the decision. And so this is really important. And we've discovered that there are 4 things that the people in the church are going to need through any transition process. The first thing they're going to need is they're going to need to accept the new reality. They are going to have a new pastor. And the pastor that they know, the pastor they're familiar with, the pastor that they love, the pastor who was the pastor when they started coming to this church, he will no longer be their senior pastor. There will be a new pastor in their church. They're going to have to accept that reality, and that's really hard for some people. I mean, it's really hard. Like a lot of pastors don't realize how much they're loved and how much they're appreciated. And so that news hits people hard, but that they're going to need that during the transition process. Is they're going to need to accept the new reality. The second thing they're going to need is they're going to need to know that their pastor who is moving on has a sense of future and vision for his own life. It's always helpful if they know that the pastor's moving on to another ministry. Maybe he's going to the mission field, or maybe he's going to be involved in consulting other churches, or maybe he's going to be involved in a Bible college somewhere, or maybe he's going to go get his complete his seminary education and teach in a university somewhere. There are a myriad of ways that the senior pastor can continue his ministry in very effective ways. But for the church to know that our senior pastor that has loved us and served us and fed us for all these years is moving on to another phase of his ministry life, that really helps them. That helps them get excited about what God is going to do through the pastor that is moving on. The third thing that your church needs is they need confidence in the process. They need to know that this whole transition process is being handled wisely, is being handled well, and they can buy into it. Really important, because obviously if they have confidence in it, they'll be praying for it, they'll be giving toward it, their attendance will be consistent, their contributions and ministry commitments will be consistent, and the church will stay together very well. And the fourth thing they'll need is confidence in their future. They need to know and be confident that the right man is going to be identified and the right man is going to be called to take over and be the senior pastor of their church. They need to know that the guy that is going to be named is the man that Jesus has named. And, of course, that has a lot to do with their confidence in the process. So all of these things are part of the whole overall idea of you are thinking about transitioning your church. And so here are some of the suggestions we have for you. Just some final thoughts, though, before we wrap this podcast up. Be willing, pastor, if God is calling you, be willing to take a step of faith. Remember, you started out that way in ministry. You were probably bivocational at some point. You probably took a step of faith to move to the area that you're ministering in, and it was way beyond what you thought God might do, but He did it anyway. You can do it again. You can take a next step of faith in your own life. The Lord will take care of you. Matthew 6:33 applies to every senior pastor as much now as it did in the moment that He called us. Another thing that I wanted to share and remind you of is that you are still a pastor-teacher. If you do decide to transition out of your church, you are still a pastor-teacher. God gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. He gave the pastor-teacher to the church to equip them. You are still a pastor-teacher. God's gifts are irrevocable. He's not going to take that gifting away from you. You are still a pastor-teacher. But you may not be a pastor-teacher with the role of a senior pastor. There are many different gifts, but there are also many different kinds of ministries that operate from that gifting. Your role, your calling of pastor-teacher will be described differently in the future, in whatever your future is. So you're still a pastor-teacher, but you're not a senior pastor, and that's okay. There's a lot more to say on this subject, of course. You can read up on the subject. The book Next by the Vanderbloemen Group is a really good book on pastoral transition. Dave Rolfe of Calvary Chapel in Laguna Niguel has written his doctoral thesis on the subject of pastoral transitions within Calvary Chapel. There was a summary of a workshop that was done at one of the pastor conferences years ago with David Guzik and Tom Stipe and Dave Rolfe that was written up that described the process and some of the ingredients of pastoral transitions. And by now, there are a number of success stories and very interesting accounts of how churches that are Calvary Chapel churches have transitioned in the past. And all of these can be great sources of learning. We did a podcast with Pastor Bill Walden on pastoral transition that works. That podcast is very helpful as well. Lot to say. Do your reading, do your listening, do your learning. And then, of course, we would be happy to help in whatever way we can with Poimen Ministries. We'd be happy to talk with you about any questions you have, talk through your situation, speak with your elders, anything you need. We're just here to support you, and we're here to support your fellowship in the process. If you should decide to step out and move on to another field of ministry and turn the church over to someone else, we want to help to make sure, as much as we can and as much as is humanly possible, we want to work with Jesus, to work with you, to make sure that that happens. So God bless you. If you want to contact us again, email us at strongerpastors@gmail.com, and we just look forward to helping you in any possible way we can. And please, email us and just give us feedback on this podcast. It was helpful to you. That would be appreciated. God bless you. And until next time, may the Lord strengthen you in your ministry.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Poimen Ministries. You can find us at poimenministries.com. That's spelled Poimen Ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or desire to connect with us, or if you have a comment or a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. Until we meet again, may you continue to be a strengthened pastor.